Lodgement. Smoke, Crockett pointed and the rest of their heads swiveled in that direction. A thin cloud of smoke blossomed over the treetops, trailing on a higher wind in the same direction they were flying on the stolen hovercraft. "What do you think, Lieutenant?" Babe asked. Lieutenant William Bonney squinted at the horizon through the reflective faceplate he wore connected to his helmet. A heads-up display seemed to respond to his thoughts and zoomed in on the column of smoke with 3 clicks. He stared at a closer version and marveled as the composition components scrolled across the screen in front of his retina. "Wood smoke," he said. "Too big for a campfire." "Building?" Babe said. He was staring at his own scroll of information feeding across the faceplate he wore. Lieutenant nodded. Babe put a hand on Crockett's shoulder. "Check it out." He pulled on the yoke to send the alien hovercraft over the trees and angled them on an intercept vector. "Be ready," Lieutenant advised the rest of the squad. He watched Jake and Steph, 2 prisoners who had been conscripted into his war against the aliens, shift in their stance and hold their blaster rifles at ready. Weber and Renard, 2 veterans who claimed to be from the Lost Martian Front, knelt behind the partially raised side of the hovercraft and aimed over the edge. Jake took note and tapped Steph on the shoulder. He imitated the veterans and she followed his example. The hovercraft floated 30 feet off the ground, the color of the smoke changing as they approached, growing darker and thicker. From here, Lieutenant could make out a clearing in the trees up ahead, a patch of forest missing in the dense canopy of leaves. "Circle round," he instructed Crockett and the man piloting the hovercraft complied. They were too noisy to make a silent approach, and too high to sneak in. The least they could do was change direction, Lieutenant thought. Crockett couldn't set down on top of the trees, so he shot across the edge of the clearing and dropped toward the churned ground. It was a town of survivors, or once had been. 5 wooden huts, burned shells now, still smoldered from blackened piles of ash. "Cold-blooded murderin' sons of bitches," Lieutenant muttered. The ground was littered with bodies. Human bodies. Men were burned beyond recognition, black skeletons curled in fetal positions, weapons tossed aside on some, clutched in the charred fingers of others. Women and children were scattered in front of 2 buildings, only known by the smaller corpses they left behind. "Another bomb?" Waldo offered as they settled on the ground with only a slight lurch. Lieutenant shook his head. He didn't know. They had been at a compound before when the Licks dropped a concussive bomb that took out a lot of people. But those bodies hadn't been burned. The Licks wouldn't want their new slaves unable to work. He hopped over the edge of the hovercraft and blanched as his boots squished into the ground. It was wet with blood, or what looked like it. "Cover," he said as Babe started to get out with him. "Lieutenant?" "Watch the trees, Babe. Anyone left alive is going to come from there." "What about the Licks?" This was no Damlick, Lieutenant grunted. He trusted his squad to cover the perimeter, but readied his rifle as he stepped among the dead. There were too many of them. The entire compound was slaughtered. "I've got to tell you, this gets the Scotch-Irish in me pretty damned riled up," Lieutenant spat. "I got us spending all our time trying to save the fucking human race, and these piece of crap egg suckers go and make all my effort wasted." He saw the bush quiver out of the corner of his eye and whipped around with his blaster. A small scream echoed from the underbrush as he sent a laser shot smoking through the leaves. "Come on out," Lieutenant shouted. Babe and Waldo spread away from him, flanking whoever or whatever it was hiding in the brambles. They watched a tiny hand reach out and lift the greenery to one side. A second hand spread it farther apart and a mud-smudged face peeked through the opening. Large brown eyes blinked at them, dripping tears through the dirt-crusted cheeks. "Come on out now," Lieutenant said, his voice still crisp with annoyance at being startled. A small boy crawled out of the underbrush. He was covered in mud, and darker stains that could have been blood. His movements were frantic, jerky, and he kept watch on the alien-looking men in giant armor aiming guns at him. Steph pushed past Lieutenant. "Lower your guns," she chided. "He's terrified." She kneeled in front of the boy as he flinched away from her. "Hey buddy," she cracked a smile, trying to ease his fear. "He's not a dog," said Waldo. "I've got eyes," she said. "You're talking to him like he's a dog." "I am not." "Here boy," Waldo imitated her voice. "Sounds like a dog to me." "Ask him who he is," Lieutenant ordered. "He probably speaks English," said Steph. Do you speak English boy?" Waldo kept up the high-pitched voice a lot of pet owners used. The mud-covered kid growled. "Sounds like a dog," Waldo shrugged. "I don't know Waldo," said Babe. Talking to me like that would piss me off enough to growl too. Cut the bullshit, said Lieutenant. Ask him what happened. He turned and stalked back to the hovercraft toward Weber and Renard. You two, circle the perimeter, see what you can pick up. Weber glanced at Renard, then readied his rifle. He took a few steps ahead of the younger man, who followed after him, both of their heads on a swivel as they searched for any threats or clues. Steph held out her hand to the boy. How long have you been here? He stared at the glove covering her outstretched palm and his lower lip began to quiver. One tiny hand stretched toward hers and settled into her grip. She closed her glove over it, soft and reassuring as his tiny shoulders began to heave, small sobs hiccuping over the still crackling embers of the ash-covered piles. Chapter 2. Lick Commander stared at the holographic image that floated 6 feet off of the floor. His long slender tongue flickered in and out of his mouth, tasting the air and revealing his frustration as he stared at the back of his eminence. His leader had contacted him to deliver instructions and receive a report, no doubt. His nestmate had a hand in arranging this meeting, but no sooner had the bulbous giant leader signed on to the communications array, he turned away from the Lick Commander to consult with his council. It was an act designed to show him his place in the scheme of things, Lick Commander realized. What he had considered an honor, to watch over a nestmate and keep her safe, he now considered as a fellow exile. She was either a spy sent to report back on his loyalty, or exploit his shortcomings in the fight against the humans, or an ally. He had yet to determine which despite sharing his sex with her. The back heaved with laughter as someone he could not see spoke to his leader and amused him. Lick Commander held his shoulders rigid, his yellow eyes narrowed in anger. That his eminence would ignore him was expected. That he would do so in front of an assembled group of other commanders was insufferable. Lick Commander hoped the nestmate was here to help. He would like nothing more than to eliminate the ineffective and inefficient leadership in front of him, staring with clearing the entire room. A well-placed bomb would do the work, he thought. Something from the human arsenals that would lay the blame on that species of parasites. He wanted to turn away, return to getting reports on the progress of clearing the base with the new slaves. He wanted to return to the nestmate exiled with him, the scent of their most recent passionate encounter clinging to his scaly skin. But he waited. It was what a good soldier would do. Chapter 3. What are we waiting on? Weber grumbled. I thought we were fighting Licks. This is wasting time, Renard added. Babe grunted his assent. Lieutenant ignored them. He was good at ignoring a lot of things, years of practice making him an expert at projecting a stony expression. But he heard them. Still, he didn't take his eyes off Steph as she gripped the hand of the dirt-covered urchin in front of them. What's your name? He asked. The kid blanched away from the alien-looking visage bending toward him. Lieutenant nodded and popped his visor open with a snick, revealing ice-blue eyes and a perpetual squint. You got a name? He asked again, making a point to make his voice soft, less threatening than his normal gruff rasp. The kid nodded. Tears and snot mixed together under his nose and turned the dirt on his lip into a muddy mustache. What is it? The kid shook his head. Lieutenant squinted harder as his eyes moved around the squad. That's Babe, Lieutenant pointed to the giant standing between the two veterans of Mars. Waldo, Crockett, Weber, Renard. You're holding on to Annie Oakley there. She squeezed the kid's hand. There, said Lieutenant, now you know us. Want to tell us your name? The dirty-faced urchin shook his head. No? Why the hell not? You're strangers. Lieutenant snickered, an odd sound among the carnage spread around them. Last man standing, Babe snorted. And still won't talk. Lieutenant glared at the death surrounding them, sniffed the air. That's all right, boy. You don't have to tell us your name if you don't want. The kid sobbed and wiped the back of his hand across his mouth, smearing the mud in a long grubby streak. I'm not a boy, he sniffed. Lieutenant squinted harder. Steph pulled her into a rough armor-coated side hug. It's a girl, Lieutenant, said Waldo. My ears ain't broke, Lieutenant answered as he watched Steph try to comfort the girl. Damn. He was looking at her, but his mind was taking a trip, one of those quick memory flashes that steal up on a person and carry them off, usually when things are quiet but on occasion when the timing wasn't perfect. He looked beyond the mud and tears, around the armored arm and into the soft lines of her face, the youthful cheeks sunken, the coarse hair matted and ratty around her face. Clothes, layers of them, hiding the frail young body. Lieutenant was staring at a girl who might have been the same age as his daughter, had she lived. Fucking Licks, he growled, and the little girl flinched, cringing into Steph's suit as fire flashed in the lieutenant's eyes. "Your folks in there?" he rasped. She nodded, the tears all gone, or just cried out. "Give her a drink," he told Steph and handed her a hydration pouch from a pack. The little girl took it and sucked on the end like she hadn't had water in days. Steph let her get 2 mouthfuls and pulled it away before she drank too much and got sick. "Ask her if she saw what happened here?" Lieutenant instructed. But he was sure she had. "Young eyes shouldn't be that haunted." "I can hear you," she said, her young voice stronger now that it was wet, though still thick with tears and sadness. "Then answer if you can," Lieutenant snapped, the words coming out harsher than he meant. Certainly, harsher than he would have spoken to his own daughter, harder than he intended. "I can," she snarled back. "Soldiers." She sniffed again and swiped at the mud on her cheeks and face. "That it? Isn't that enough?" Steph answered for her. "You knew it wasn't aliens." Lieutenant nodded. "Lutz," Babe reminded him, an attempt to steer him back to mission. Lieutenant waved him off. "I ain't forgot, Babe. I'm just saying, we can file that rugrat into the hovercraft and get going. She can tell us whatever story she wants on the way." "We could leave her," said Waldo. "We're not leaving her," Steph huffed. She held out her hand to the little girl and flexed her palm. Lieutenant made a circling motion with his finger. "Let's go if you're going, Rugrat." He marched past Weber and Renard on his way to the hovercraft. "What kind of outfit are you running here?" Weber whispered after him. But if Lieutenant heard, he didn't answer. Chapter 4. Lutz stared at the back of the girl, but she wouldn't turn her head to look at him. No one would. No one dared. The other prisoners walked with a practiced shuffle, heads bent low, eyes watching the toes of their dingy shoes. Lutz was surprised at how fast they learned to adopt the walk, as if there was an unwritten code about how to act on the base. Or maybe he wasn't so surprised. He had watched another prisoner get his head bashed in for staring. That kind of instruction made an impression. That kind of instruction got everyone in line quick. He cleaned a hovercraft under the slit yellow eyes of a lick soldier that roamed over the working trio. He watched the 6-foot lizard from the corner of his eye, seeming intent on the task in front of him, but studying the way it stood, how it held the blaster in its 3-clawed hand. The guard's eyes blinked once, twice, then closed. The tongue that was normally flicking in and out to taste air, to taste scent, was still. Lutz couldn't believe it. The soldier guarding them fell asleep. He kept moving, kept his motion slow and controlled, and turned his head ever so slightly to get a better look. Yes, the yellow eyes were closed, the snout frozen in a mask of respite. Lutz couldn't help it. He grinned. He almost motioned to the man next to him, to show him that the soldier acting as their guard was catching a nap. But he needn't bother. The man noticed, dropped the mop he was using to scrub soot marks off the hole and pounded across the pitted asphalt toward the fence. A second guard lifted his rifle and sent a blaster bolt searing into the fleeing man's back 100 yards away. The laser almost sliced him in half, the upper torso pitching over even as the legs ran 4 more steps before falling in a splattered heap. The lick who fired the round stepped out of hiding behind a building and watched the rest of the slaves to see if any were going to make a run for it too. No one did. He slid back into the shadows of his cover and Lutz lost sight of him. 2, a small voice whispered beside him. Maybe 3. The sound of it sent a thrill up his spine. It was the voice from the darkness. The raspy sound made him want to smile almost as much as the still snoozing guard. "Did you know?" he whispered back. "We suspected. Now we know." Which made Lutz wonder. Did the man sacrifice himself just to give the raspy-voiced girl the intel? He turned his head to look at her, but only caught the back of her dark hair as she scooted away. She was slight of frame, the clothes on her frame oversized making her look even smaller. He couldn't see her face, just the shape of her from behind, and even that was distorted by the fabric she wore. But it was her. He was sure of it. There was no mistaking that voice. And whoever she was planning an escape. Chapter 5. Lieutenant shifted onto his haunches in front of the fire, cradling the rifle in the crook of his hips. He almost held out his hands to warm them, and pulled back after a moment of hesitation. He wasn't cold. The suit took care of that. It was just a habit, born of spending the last several hundred nights sleeping outdoors. The suit took care of a lot of needs. The nano inside of him modulated his hunger, his thirst. It modulated his adrenal production, and he suspected it controlled his sleep as well, dropping melatonin in his system when he decided it was time to catch some shut-eye. Wonders, he thought. He stared into the flames and thought about Lutz. He let his mind drift over the possibilities of planning, what they were up against, and it flittered from idea to thought and back again. Sometimes he liked to do that, just let the jumble of everything inside his head bounce around, bounce off each other, hoping maybe one or two will click together and form a plan or the kernel of a new idea. Brainstorming, they called it, and he liked the way it felt because there was a lot of thunder and lightning cracking around in between his ears. He glanced at the group around him. The fire threw shadows across their bodies, playing against the trees. Too large, he thought, too easy to see, but he drew up short from kicking dirt over the edges to tamp it down. They deserved a fire, and if any prying eyes from Lick or enemies otherwise unknown saw it, he wanted them to bring it on. His squad was hard to identify in their suits. Babe looked like Waldo, Crockett looked like Jake. All the same, all uniform. Hard to tell who was who unless the visors were up. "That won't do," he muttered aloud. "What did you say, Lieutenant?" Babe sat up. "Just pondering some ideas, babe. Been thinking on our next step." "Get Lutz." "Yeah, that and one more stop to make." Babe glanced over at the still lump of a child under a pilfered blanket near the edge of the firelight. "Drop off," the big man nodded. "We're picking up a lot of strays." He was ready to be rid of their new charge. "We're not strays," Steph said from across the clearing, her back against a pine tree. "You rescued us. We're just joining the cause." "Is that what we are?" Waldo joked. "A cause? Name's as good as any," Lieutenant said. "Course if you folks had been raised upright, you'd call yourself the Rebel Alliance." "That movie again, Lieutenant?" He nodded, earning a couple of half-grins and smirks. "You boys don't even know," he said. "It defined a generation. Practically a documentary." "My dad liked it," said Babe. "Jesus, Babe, I ain't that much older than you. I guess I'm just more educated on things that matter." "Like space movies." "We're in a space movie," said Jake. "The truth was out there, and then it came here." Weber popped his visor up. "You talk too much when it's time to sleep," he said. "Real soldiers learn, eat when you can, sleep when you can." "We're real enough," Waldo said. "How many licks you got notched up?" Weber shrugged. "I've got over 100, Waldo continued. "Oh, the lieutenant about 900 more." "How do you keep count once the killing starts?" "After," said Babe. "It's a head count." He waited for them to get it, but Weber just stared at him with his sky-blue eyes glowing in the reflected firelight. "We take their heads," the big man clarified. "I understood you," said Weber. "I just don't understand the reason." "We aim to make the Lick fear us," Lieutenant said. "The Lick will have nightmares of the atrocities it has seen in the path of destruction we carve through their invasion." Weber sat up, grunting as he propped against the tree. The nano-head went to work on his injuries as soon as he dropped in the suit, and his body felt good. The grunting was habit for the most part, the aches ghosts of the pain they had once been. "How's that working out for you?" he asked, blue eyes curious in the firelight. Lieutenant pondered this, arms crossed across his knees. Truth be told, he wasn't sure if the Lick were checking under their beds at night to see if he and his men were there. There damn sure was enough of them left to kill, that the numbers he and his squad had sent to meet their Lick maker didn't seem to faze them much. "I suppose we could do better," he offered. "You've been hitting the soldiers," said Weber. His eyes drifted to a point over Lieutenant's shoulder, staring at a blinking light in the sky. A distant star, he thought, though he remembered hearing that you could see Mars from Earth sometimes. He wasn't sure what part of the sky it liked to hang around in, so it could be Mars. Or Polaris. Or Alpha Centauri. But Mars made him think of past battles and reasons they were lost. "There are so many of them," he said. His voice was a growl across the clearing, carrying to everyone. Lieutenant noted that no one slept, except Rugrat, and if she was awake, she was doing a fine job of fooling everyone into thinking she was not. "Everywhere we went, across the face of the Red Planet," Weber continued. "So many? At Citadel, thousands. They kept coming from all over. And when we moved on the colony, to take out the guns, more. Out of the sand, out of every hole. Like ants when you kick over an anthill." "Or hornets," said Renard, with the same far-off look in his eye. "When you hit a nest." "That's how they beat us?" Lieutenant asked. "Just sheer fucking numbers?" Weber shrugged. "Numbers. Deck. Maybe just indomitable fighting spirit." He nodded past the hovercraft in the direction where they had found the burned town. "Sometimes we're too busy killing each other to stop the aliens from killing us. Hell, if they would have held back a couple of years, We would have finished the job for them. Lieutenant grunted. He had no answer for that. Sure, Earth had some problems before the Lick Armada popped up on long-scanning radar. Politicians had even tried to keep it quiet for a while, but too many backyard astronomers with eyes in the sky made that impossible. And still they fought each other. Even as they sent soldiers to Mars, the countries jockeyed for power, for position, for lines on the map, and once humans started losing, for resources. Lieutenant sighed and squinted at the embers. "I hear you," he said. "Don't seem like much worth saving sometimes, don't it? Every worthless perkerwood in the bunch seems to show up when we're at our lowest, trying to set themselves up a little potentate. Makes me wonder why I even bother every time I look in the mirror." "You got a mirror, Lieutenant?" Crockett joked. "Cracked one," Lieutenant grunted back. "That explains the shave," his man shot back and earned a snort of appreciation from his commander. "I wonder why, if I'm being the philosophical sort and the mood strikes me right. But that kind of thinking stretches back all the way through history. Seems like we always done this. Invasions brought out the worst in a lot of folks. But I think we leave out some of the best parts. The good ones don't always make history, or history lessons at least." "That why you're fighting?" Weber asked. "You want to go down in history as a good one?" "Hell no, Weber," Lieutenant scoffed. "I want to be the damn Pol Pot of the Licks. I want to kill every last one of those motherfuckers and put all their damn heads in a rocket and shoot it toward their home world as a warning. I want them dead. Gone and scared as hell to come back. I don't give a shit how history remembers me. I just want there to be a history to remember." "Do we still have rockets?" Jake asked. "What? You said put their heads in a rocket and shoot it to their home. Can we do that?" "That's a tomorrow problem." Lieutenant slipped back off his haunches and settled into the ground. "Rockets are tomorrow. Lutz is tomorrow. Dropping that rugrat off is tomorrow. Tonight's problem is getting shut-eye." He laced his fingers across his chest and stared up at the stars. The dry wood in the fire popped and crackled as he heard the others settle in around him. He didn't know if they slept, the silence didn't share that much. But he watched the sky spin above him for a long time, until the eastern edge of the horizon slipped dark purple to hint at the dawn, and he was able to drop into a deep nap. Chapter 6. The next morning dawned under wispy strands of fog that filtered through the trees and cowered over the still smoking embers of the campfire. Lieutenant kicked a pile of dirt over the glowing coals, burying them. "Why did you do that?" a small voice asked from beside him. He glanced at Rugrat through his visor. "Keeps from starting a forest fire. Only you can prevent forest fires," he grinned, even though she couldn't see it. "A forest fire? Damn kid, ain't you ever seen a wildfire gone wild?" She shook her head. "I don't like fire," she murmured and cast a glance over her shoulder in the direction of the still smoldering town on their back trail. "I bet you don't," said Waldo as he stepped up next to Lieutenant Perimeter Clear. "Crockett, start this boat up and let's get going." He led them into the back of the hovercraft as Crockett engaged the throttle and lifted off of the ground. Lieutenant studied the road in front of them, letting information scroll across the display on his helmet. It took some getting used to. The system was set up to deliver temperature, windage, distance to objects as they entered his field of vision. It also monitored vitals, and he could see a space where oxygen levels would show, but it was blank for him. That made sense. The suits had been designed to fight in the harsh and unforgiving atmosphere of Mars, and would need oxygen. He wondered about how he was getting air now, here on Earth, and made a mental note to ask Doc about it when they got back to the compound. If they got back, he thought. He wondered if the suits were giving them too much confidence. But no, his small squad had done plenty of damage before the suits, still using the old-school technology they had been left with after the alien first wave sent them almost literally back into the Dark Ages. The confidence to take on a base with such a small force came from the ability to beat the Licks so many times. Plus, he was still thinking about a distraction. Something to draw the main force of their troops away from his point of entry, then hit them from the flanks and behind. It was the sort of problem he couldn't hit head-on. It was like running into a brick wall through a mud hole. Slow and heavy. The way he needed to figure it out was come at it from the corners. Let the different inputs fall together in his mind, until all the pieces fit like a puzzle to show him a new picture. That's just the way his mind worked. Dump a lot of data into it, and figure it out as he went. "Lieutenant?" "Yeah, Waldo?" "We're following the wrong trail." Lieutenant glanced over the edge of the hovercraft. "Nah. Crockett's doing exactly what I asked him to do. What we need him to do." Lutz has to wait while we find the assholes that did this? Lieutenant nodded. Something like that. You know Lutz is going through hell waiting on us, said Babe. No, Babe, I don't know that. For all we know, Lutz is gone. He said it, but he didn't feel it. He found it when Leroy and Danish and Suds died. Same with Rook. But not so with Lutz. Thing is, Lutz is pretty good at taking care of himself if he's in trouble, and he can keep his head down. But this, he indicated the rugrat. This needs looking into. Chapter 7. The hovercraft slowed to a halt and settled on the edge of the road. Lieutenant hopped out and marched to the ridge where the asphalt looked like it disappeared. It was an optical illusion. The road rose to the point of the ridge and slipped over the other side. Lieutenant stood at the highest-most point and let his eyes wander. The shimmering ribbon of blacktop kept going down a long glade that stretched for miles. The grass on either side of the road was long, still green under the sun but with blooms of yellow hinting that the dry weather roasted the pasture. The road kept going through the land below, crossed a sliver of river on a suspension bridge and got lost in more woods on the other side. But that's not what drew his attention. Another camp was set up on the riverbank. Camouflage tents were erected in tight circles that made 3 rings, each surrounding a giant pavilion in the middle. Wonder who they think they're hiding from? Babe snorted from next to him. Weber and Renard sidled next to Babe. What are they? Renard asked. That's the fellas that decided to burn up that town back there, Lieutenant growled. How do you know? Weber asked. It's them. He pointed to the churned-up ground next to the asphalt, boot prints imprinted in the mud, the grass flattened. Big force came through here and they weren't flying on hovercrafts. Could be someone else? Weber said. Who? The veteran shrugged. You've seen something like this before? Nothing, said Waldo as he joined them. Of course, we haven't been this far out of the forest in forever. That's a big group, said Babe. Ain't normal, Lieutenant observed. Attracts too much attention. A group like that, they're asking for trouble, or expecting it. If the licks come along, the ones in the middle are getting protected. And if it's humans, that setup is supposed to be intimidating. So, we're intimidated, Weber said. I'm feeling something, said Waldo. I don't think it's intimidated though. How about you, Babe? You feel intimidated? You're just remembering standing next to me at Privy this morning, Babe said. Afraid you'll never feel like a real man again. Waldo laughed and shifted his blaster up. The targeting software zoomed in on the camp. He could make out people moving, just vague shapes from this distance. Too far to shoot, he said. Save your bullets, Lieutenant said. I'm going down there to talk. Lasers, Lieutenant, and is that a good idea? I'm not going alone, Babe. One of you is coming with me. Babe stood taller. Not you, said Bonnie. You and Weber are going to sneak up on the other side of the road. Be ready to pull my bacon out of the fire if it comes to it. Then who's going with you? I will, Jake volunteered. Chief, Lieutenant glanced back at him. Babe frowned, but he didn't say anything, just waved Weber to follow him. Lieutenant watched the 2 suits march up the far side of the road. Let's go, Chief, Lieutenant said. We're walking? Crockett, keep everyone loaded up. You see trouble, you either come in to pick us up, or you get gone. Savvy? Yes sir, Lieutenant. Lieutenant led Jake on the asphalt. They trotted into a fast jog and 8 the miles away to the camp below. Chapter 8. What's your name? He whispered in the semi-darkness. None of the lights worked in the warehouse where they were imprisoned, but there were windows along the top of the building that let in dim starlight. Not enough to make out details, but shapes. He recognized her by the shape of her head and felt another thrill in his stomach as she turned. There were guards they could see posted on either end of the building, but Lutz had found space in the middle, a piece of concrete to call his own. And the shadow crab crawling across the floor to sit next to him moved with a slow precision that wouldn't attract attention. Don't move so much, she said as he rolled over to face her shadow. You crawled over here, he reminded her. But I've had more practice than you. Crawling? Crawling, sneaking. I saw you. You don't seem like much of a sneaker. Lutz snorted. I'm an excellent sneaker. Oh yeah, when have you ever snuck up on anything? Snuck around anything? You make too much noise, attract too much attention. Strutting. I don't strut, he said. I'm a. He stopped short of telling her he was a soldier, one of Lieutenant Bonnie's men. While he bet she didn't know who exactly Lutz was in the scheme of the squad, William Bonney's exploits had spread among the surviving human population. Babe was the most popular of the men, he knew, and didn't begrudge him the title. There was something to be said about being an effective unknown member of the most devastating team to fight back against the alien invaders. But this girl could be a spy. And if she wasn't, there were people around who might be. They could turn him in, trade on his identity for safety, or food, or hell, even survival. "You're a what?" she whispered. Damn, thought Lutz. He hoped she would miss it. But she was paying as much attention to him as he was to her, straining to make out more in the milky glow leaking in through the upper windows. "I'm just a prisoner, like you." "Slave," she scoffed. "But not like me." He heard a noise in the corner, from the direction where the guard stood and held his tongue. He could feel her holding her breath beside him. Around them, people snorted and made the kinds of noises people make when they're sleeping. But Lutz noticed they were muted sounds, as if even in the act of sleeping, the prisoners were afraid of being noticed, of being found out. The two of them held their silence, stretched for several moments, long enough for Lutz to wonder if she had fallen asleep. He strained to listen to her breathing, to measure the rise and fall of the dark lump at the edge of his field of vision. "My name is Pomona," she said. "Like the horse?" Lutz whispered back. "Like the city in California," she sounded sharp. Lutz knew what her nickname would be if Lieutenant met her first. Cali. That was the only thing he could think of, and when it popped to the forefront of his mind, he snorted a small laugh. He'd been hanging out with Lieutenant too much. "Carl," he said. "But call me Lutz." "Why not call you Carl?" "Because everyone calls me Lutz." He could see one of her shoulders heave, and assumed it was a shrug. "What are you, Lutz? You were going to tell me something." "You're planning an escape," he said. She was quiet then, and he was reminded of something else Lieutenant told him. Sometimes, it was best just to keep your trap shut and wait for someone else to talk. Something about he who speaks first, loses. In this case, Lutz figured it was she who speaks first, and he wondered if she was planning to test him. It might have worked. He would have tried to find more ways to get her alone, to pursue her agenda, to find out the plan. But she didn't make him play for it. "I am," she whispered. "I want in," Lutz told her. And as the night stretched toward morning, he listened to her plan. Chapter 9. "I don't like this plan," Jake said. He felt like huffing, because in the past he had. He jogged with Lieutenant, an 8-minute mile that felt like nothing to the two of them as the nanos surged in their system and controlled the aches, the oxygen delivery, the lactic acid removal. "You got a better suggestion, Chief?" Jake shook his head. He didn't. What he had was a nagging feeling that this was the wrong play. "It doesn't feel right," he shared. "Being out here, just the two of us, going into the lion's den?" Again, he shook his head. That wasn't it. There was something about the camp that felt off, something about the situation that bothered him. But he couldn't put his finger on it. "It doesn't feel like a trap," he said. "I studied it," Lieutenant told him. "It's not a trap." "Then what is it? Why is it bothering me?" "Chief," Lieutenant said, "I think you've got what we call pre-battle jitters. Your body's producing adrenaline in anticipation of the old fight-or-flight reflex, only this time we ain't going up against the fucking licks. We're taking the war right into the heart of a pile of humans. It don't sit well with you." "I don't think I care about that," said Jake. "Well, I fucking do," Lieutenant growled. "I fucking hate it. This is a waste of my fucking time, trying to bring a bunch of damn idiots into line, time that could be spent fighting the real enemy. But human nature, being what it is, requires me to iron glove the shit out of these fuckers to bring them back in line. I care about it quite a bit." Jake ran beside him in silence as the miles to the camp dropped away. He considered the human encampment as they drew closer, and wondered if he did care about the fact that they were not aliens. He wasn't bothered about the confrontation they might have. He wasn't concerned that they were people instead of aliens. If there was fighting to be done, he would do it. What bothered him was the timing. They were in a stolen hovercraft on the way to the alien base and just happened to run across a group that tortured other humans. Lieutenant was right. It was a waste of his time to deal with it, but to Jake, it felt more like distraction. He screamed as a flaming ball of rubbish arced through the air and smashed down on the asphalt in front of them. It exploded in a cascade of flaming debris, showering their suits with sticky burning pitch and flames. Jake screamed as he watched his arm burn, waved it to try and put out the fire. Then he realized he didn't feel the heat. Nothing burned through the suit. The fire scorched the exterior, but he was all right. A second round ball of flames arced up into the sky. "Are they using fucking catapults?" Lieutenant screamed and aimed his blaster. He sent a laser shot into the ball at the height of its flight, creating a miniature supernova that rained embers, coal and flaming debris on top of and around them. Jake took a knee and rested the blaster against his shoulder. He searched the area where the flying cannonballs were coming from, and saw tiny figures working around a cart, with a long wooden arm on it. "Trebuchet!" Lieutenant screamed and shot a blast into the group. Jake sent two more after his, clipping one of the ropes holding the arm down. The tension slammed the arm forward, the torque so strong it flipped the cart over, and trapped several of the men manning it in the flaming wreckage. They could hear the screams of the dying men as more figures raced out of the woods. They were armed with hunting rifles and pistols, a couple of M16 automatic weapons, and all aimed at the two soldiers in suits on the road. An order was screamed, and the howling group opened fire. Bullets pinged into the suits, ricocheted off. Lieutenant and Jake stood under the onslaught. It hurt. But the suits were bulletproof against conventional weapons and neither man was harmed. Like being hit with a stick or a bat, and Jake thought about Babe. As if thinking of him brought the man to life, Babe and Weber ran in from the woods and flanked the men attacking them. Lieutenant sent one warning shot into the crowd, blasting three men into smoking chunks of ruined flesh. Babe and Weber sent a shot each, laying out five more men. Then the man who screamed the order to fire now screamed retreat. The group broke in panic and ran back toward the tents. "Do we chase them?" Jake stood up. Lieutenant reached over with a gloved hand and patted the flames off of one of the boy's armored arms. "Yeah," he said. "I suppose we should. Think they won't feel like talking too much now we done killed so many of 'em." "You sound disappointed," said Jake. Lieutenant started marching up the road, past the still smoldering bodies of what once had been men laid to waste by his blaster. "I don't like killing humans," Lieutenant said. "Even fucking scum of the earth murdering sons of bitches like these." Jake watched Lieutenant pull ahead as they got closer to the tent city set up on the side of the road. They were closer to the riverbank than he thought, a small shallow dip that ran 20 feet to the swirling water below. Jake saw clothes spread out on the blue river rock to dry, and heard people screaming as they approached. Babe and Weber joined them. "Old-fashioned weapons," said Weber. "I've only read about those in history books." "What were they?" "Catapults," said Weber. "Trebuchets," Jake corrected. "What's the difference?" Babe asked. Jake shrugged. "It's what Lieutenant said." "If they had those, they might have built shit," Weber shouted and shouldered them both to the ground. A 6-foot arrow sliced the air over their head. Weber whipped his blaster to his shoulder and had enough time to watch another arrow plow into Lieutenant's chest plate and knock the man backwards, narrow wooden shaft vibrating as it stood straight up in the air. Chapter 10. Lit Commander stared at the nestmate stretched in front of him, the lazy gaze of her yellow eyes watching him as her tongue flickered in satiated pleasure. "He underestimates you," she hissed. Here, in the privacy of his chambers, they could forego the voice box translators worn on chunky chains around their throats, but she kept her chip on, so he did as well. The humans had a saying he had heard of, and he found it very fitting. "When in Rome." It translated well to his native tongue. He preened under her adoring gaze and worked to remind himself that she was trained in the art of making even the lowliest soldier feel like his eminence. Part art, but he was open to the possibility that she was right, that their leader did indeed underestimate him. A part of his subterfuge, he told himself. But also his fear. Perhaps all underestimated what he was capable of achieving because they could see the truth. And if they were able to see the truth, then the concubine lounging in front of him, basking in the afterglow of their sex, would be a liar. If she could lie about such things, one thing, then she could lie about everything. To his detriment, Lit Commander answered. "Will you share your plans with me?" His tongue flickered in and out, masking the indecision. He took a calming breath. She would taste his fear, his indecision. She would taste all, and perhaps report back, though he had monitored no communications from her chambers. That did not mean she didn't make them, just his techs could not discern them. "They are yet complete," he hissed. "The humans on the base have been replaced. But our initial purge of the infestation had an unforeseen consequence. There were no skilled humans left. The slaves they brought to the base were little more than janitorial staff, working on the maintenance of the occupation. Cattle to be burned through and discarded. Easily replaced. But the slaves who showed promise, the ones who knew the secrets of the world, were now too hard to find. That didn't mean he wouldn't unlock the secrets that nestled in the heart of the base, behind hidden walls and locked rooms. Those would be broken, those would be pillaged. They would give up their secrets to him, and he would in turn, decide what to share with his eminence. Decide how to share it too. His skin rippled in pleasure. The commanders of the Mars campaign, his mind still reeled at the way he was thinking even more human every day spent in this sector. Those commanders spoke of weapons the humans possessed that could harm his people, destroy them even. It was the reason His Eminence enacted the elimination protocol, the reason they slaughtered so many upon arrival. But those weapons were lost in the purge, and the men who knew about them, the humans who knew how to make them, gone as well. I would see him gone, she said. And you in his place. He rippled again. She shared his dream, but again, it was her skill, her training to do so. Yet, he pondered. They were far enough from the home world that he could rule this sector, this galaxy with the thousands of habitable planets to seed, to colonize and conquer. He could imagine himself at the head of it all, an eminence of his own. But before the dream could capture him, before he got lost in the what-if of it all, he turned away from her. "It is as you wish," he told her. "Things move fast and there is still much to be done before we reach that point." Chapter 11. "Shit," Jake screamed. He wasn't sure if any of the others heard him, but he saw Lieutenant go down and drop to his knee again to return fire. Laser blasts shot over his head and sliced into the crowd. The others had seen too. The tents caught on fire as the bolts seared through the dry canvas. People screamed, men yelled, and over it all the rat-a-tat of automatic weapons shooting back at them. Weber stooped next to Jake. "Advance in a line," he shouted an order. Jake turned his visor and saw Bernard line up next to him on the other side, blaster raised. Crockett and Waldo exited the woods on the opposite side, lasers skewing across the smoke-covered battlefield. Jake stood and marched forward with Weber and Renard, his gloved finger depressing the trigger again and again. Everywhere he aimed, death followed. He tried to concentrate on the men, or male-looking figures, though it was hard to tell with most. Each figure in his sights was a cloth-covered moving mound of clothes, faces hidden by scarves or heads hidden under hats. He aimed at the ones with weapons. Guns that were firing back at him. The trio advanced in orderly fashion, shooting as they moved. Bullets bounced off his chest plate, off the armored arms and thighs of his suit. Once or twice, a ping rocked his head back, sending a searing headache bouncing around his skull. They reached Lieutenant's fallen body. The tip of the spear was a triple blade, barbed with hooks so that any attempt to remove it would rip skin and gouge muscle. It was buried inches in the armored chest plate, testament to the force thrust of the crossbow used to shoot it. Weber stepped to one side to move around the body, still firing as he moved. Lieutenant sat up. "Son of a bitch," he yelled. It wasn't much of a yell, but the torrent of curse words he released on the tail end of the yell matched the staccato tempo of the machine gun shooting at them. The bullet slowed down when he rolled to his knees, and stopped completely when he stood up. Jake quit shooting too as he stared at the lieutenant like he was rising from the dead. The rest of the squad paused as well, blasters held ready just in case. Except for Babe. Babe shot 8 more men, their heads disappearing into puffing mists of blood and smoke. "Babe!" Lieutenant screamed. It was more like a rasp than a scream, but it cut through to his crazed soldier and made him stop. "I thought you were fucking dead," Babe snarled. "Fuck me, I thought I was too. Never been hit with an arrow before." Lieutenant looked down at the 6-foot shaft wiggling in his chest plate. "That was a good fucking move you did there, Weber. Didn't need you to save my bacon this time, but it's nice to know you've got it in you when I need it." Weber nodded. "Standard formation training," Renard said, weapon still nested into his shoulder. "Standard, huh? That shit works on Mars, but if those fuckers use a grenade, you're toast. Are you hurt?" Crockett and Waldo jogged up from their flank position. Lieutenant reached up and wrapped his glove around the shaft of the arrow, yanked it out. He dropped it on the ground and used the tip of his fingers to explore the rent in the chest plate. "Didn't get through," he said. "Huts like a son of a bitch though. That's gonna leave a mark." "Fireproof," said Jake. "Bulletproof. Arrowproof." "Ain't idiot-proof though," said Lieutenant as he turned back to the camp. "So, let's go get our fill of dumbasses." He started marching toward the camp again. "Come on boys, before they get a chance to reload that fucking crossbow contraption." Chapter 12. The escape plan was simple. As simple as something Lieutenant would come up with, thought Lutz. "Tonight? Pomona breathed out of the side of her mouth. He was surprised it sounded more like a question than a statement. The plan was to create a distraction on one side of the camp, draw the lick guards to that point, and make a break for it on the other side. The main worry was hidden guards. Hidden traps. Hell, Lutz could make a list of a million ways this could go wrong. Lieutenant would tell him that's the wrong way to think about it. Anytime you start concentrating on things going wrong, Lutz told himself in Lieutenant's raspy voice, that's all you're going to see. He even squinted his eyes in a fair imitation. Try to see what will go right and do more of that. Lutz remembered sharing an eyeroll with Babe over that one, but Lieutenant had been right. The more they focused on killing licks and doing it the right way, the better they got. The more he focused on staying alive, the more alive he stayed. It stood to reason that if they focused on what could go right during the escape, then things would go right. He tried not to think about the slaves sacrificing themselves so others could get away. That tended to freeze him up, as his mind turned the problem over trying to find a way to save everyone. Every human at least. But their sacrifice would buy many others a chance. A chance to die in the woods, being hunted, or starving, or being killed in the attempt. He shook his head. Too easy to think about the wrong. The way it was going to go down, 6 people would die. He had a small head count of 30 making the escape. 30 people running to the woods, running through the trees. It was stupid to even try, he thought. They were going to die. But Pomona had a plan for that too. Break up in pairs. No idea where they were in the world, not sure which way to break once they were beyond the fence. She told them find the North Star and follow it. Lutz didn't know what was north, and if the pairs had a half-mile between them, if they got separated in the woods, they could walk a parallel track and never know the other was there. But as far as half-assed plans went, he thought it wasn't too bad. For his part, he was going to keep the herd close together if he could. It's what Lieutenant would do. He finished up the work in the hangar by twilight, still worrying and working over the plan in his head. Lutz made his way back to the warehouse cell block in a line of other slaves. All of their heads hung low, all shuffling. He matched them step for step all the way to the door. They entered under the watchful eye of a single soldier, tongue dancing in and out of its snout, as if tasting their defeat, their exhaustion. Searching for defiance, thought Lutz, eyes still down. There was no set space on the floor, no designation to wander back in, so he moved to the center of the room where no one else was and sat with his back to the wall to wait. His brain wouldn't work the way he wanted. He couldn't figure out to keep all of them safe. He was just one man in this plan, just one man trying to get away, get back to Lieutenant and get back to killing. He needed his weapon, or any weapon to do that. I'd be better out there, he told himself. Better for any one of these survivors. I could do more good for them out there, he thought. He realized he was trying to rationalize their deaths. When there were so few of them left, even the death of one was a big loss. But he was just one man. Twilight melted into darkness and the absence of ambient light made the stars pop out and twinkle against a velvet sky. It was almost time. Lutz tensed and clenched his muscles, first stretching out one leg, then the other. He wanted to be limber when it was time to move. Then it was. A glass bottle shattered at the entrance to the room, showering the wall with gasoline. A second bottle sailed through the air, the brilliant yellow-orange flame burning the back of his pupils and popping blue flashes as it seared the darkness. It smashed against the wall, spreading more gas and fire across the wall. Weak screams echoed through the warehouse, and Lutz felt a surge of bodies press against him as they sought to escape the flames. He lunged into a run, pelted across the warehouse, bouncing off bodies as he ran. The lick soldier at the rear lifted his blaster as 4 bodies swarmed on top of him, carrying him down with their weight. The laser blast was brighter than the flames, searing a red streak across his vision as it ripped through 2 of the men piling on the lick. Then he was through the door, into the darkness and a crowd of people who broke for the fence. The hidden guard, the one Pomona had feared, leaned out and began picking off the runners one by one. But again, sacrificial lambs piled on top of him, 5 this time, trading their lives for an opportunity for others. 3 of them took it out of his perch, and thudded to the ground, where 4 more piled on top. One of the men grabbed the alien blaster and tried to use it. Lutz could have told him it wouldn't work, not for human fingers anyway. Maybe it was DNA-coded, they never found out. But lick weapons wouldn't work for humans. The same could not be said for vice versa. A 50 calories machine gun opened fire on the rest of the humans as they sprinted toward the fence. It was older machinery, the thud-thud-thud of the belt being fed sounding more like a movie than real life. But the bodies sputtered, and twisted and fell, just like the movies too, the dark earth growing darker in the starlight as blood blossomed in fountains or leaked out of the fallen. "This way," Pomona grunted in his ear and pulled on his arm. She led him away from the slaughter, at the head of a group of 4 more. They ran around the corner of the building, ran between it and another. "In here," she said and hauled open a door. Lutz and the other men surged after her, into the pitch-black opening as dark as a cave. He plowed into the back of her as she stopped. Lights popped on in exploding brilliance, bathing them in yellow incandescence, pinning them in the middle of another warehouse. Frozen. Caught. 24 soldiers created a semicircle around them. 24 blasters aimed at the 4 men. Lutz decided to charge them. Weapon or no, he wasn't going to die cowering on the floor. He was going to go out fighting. He took 2 steps into a run. "Excellent work," Lick Commander hissed, his gaze settling on Pomona as she jittered to the line of soldiers and slid through. Lutz stopped and stared. The men around him were dumbstruck as well. "These are the leaders of the escape?" Lick Commander asked. Lutz watched as he separated from the rest of the soldiers, and strutted toward them. His yellow eyes studied each of them in turn. "Smart?" he asked. "I do not think it's smart of you to seek escape. But she knows the ways of humans more so than I." He stopped in front of the last man in the row. Lutz thought he may have once been burly, but now skin sagged from his too-thin face, shoulders slumped at the betrayal. "Are you intelligent human?" Lick Commander hissed. "I am told you are able to determine things." He made a motion with a claw and the soldiers surrounding them marched forward to drag them away. Lutz looked around for Pomona as 2 Licks yanked his arms up and hauled him after the others. Their eyes locked for a brief moment, and he felt a twinge of sadness that she didn't look guilty or even bothered by her actions. Chapter 13. Lieutenant halted at the first row of tents and squinted at the vague shadows that darted among them in the interior rings. "My name is Lieutenant William Bonney, and if any more of you sons of bitches takes a shot at me, I'm going to come in there and kill every last damn one of you." He lifted his blaster rifle and sent a shot 7 feet off the ground, just over their heads unless there was an especially tall man among the group, but low enough to warn the rest. If they saw it. He had some doubt. The laser blast was bright, but the flames were turning some of the tents into infernos, and the thick smoke was making it difficult to see. "Herd him into the river," said Lieutenant as the rest of his squad caught up to him. Weber and Babe fanned out in one direction, Jake, Waldo and Renard in the other. They worked their way around the ring, and the people inside fled toward the river. They huddled in a mass of shivering confusion, the row closest to the water shoving back to keep from being pushed in and pushed under. Either end of the group was blocked by laser-toting soldiers in suits they hadn't seen before, and one of those soldiers stood in front of them and addressed the group. "Which one of you is the leader of this here outfit?" Lieutenant drawled. He cocked the blaster rifle on his hip and let it drift over their heads. "Come on, step up now and don't be shy. Sure as shit wasn't shy about shooting me with a damn bow and arrow a minute ago." Crossbow, a skinny man with a gray beard stepped from behind an even thinner woman, pushing her scrawny frame aside and resting his hand on a pistol-worn cross-draw. "That so?" Lieutenant squinted at him. "Are you really Billy the Kid?" "Fuck you," said Lieutenant as he let his blaster drift lower. "Don't call me Billy the Kid. My name is Lieutenant Bonney. For your purposes, you can refer to me as Lieutenant Bonney, though I will still answer to Lieutenant, if we get along." The blaster stopped as it reached an angle with the man's face. "We are going to get along, aren't we?" The man stared into the bore of the laser and gulped, his beard bouncing up and down, black eyes half glaring as if he was trying to decide how much a smart remark would get him shot. Then he nodded. "I don't think the folks in the back can hear you," said Lieutenant. "Are we going to get along?" "Yes," the man stuttered. "Yes." He glanced over his shoulder at the people around him. "Don't cause them any trouble," he turned back to Lieutenant. "I thought you were only fighting the aliens, not people just trying to survive." "That what you call this?" Lieutenant fingered the gash in his chest plate. "Surviving? We didn't know you were humans." Lieutenant looked at Weber and Babe. They didn't look human. Humanoid maybe. With the visors down, they were certainly intimidating. "Now I'm a reasonable man," Lieutenant said. He let his eyes drift down to Jake, Renard, and Waldo. "I can see where you made a mistake thinking we were something we were not. But now that you know what we are, just men in body armor, you can admit you were wrong." Lieutenant locked eyes with the gray-bearded man, trading squint for glare. Takes a big man to admit when he is wrong and apologize. You want me to apologize? Lieutenant just stared at him. To you? You did shoot him, said Babe. He kept his blaster locked into his shoulder, and aimed over the crowd. Ready. Just in case. He was shooting at us, the graybeard squirmed. You all were. Were we? Lieutenant called out. Chief, you shoot off first? How about you, Babe? Waldo? A chorus of no sirs echoed around the silent crowd. All right then, that's what I thought, he motioned the gray-bearded man forward. After a moment, the man complied. I ain't here to play the blame game or even to blame you for trying to kill me, Lieutenant said, leading him away from the crowd. It was a simple case of mistaken identity. Live and learn. I think that's a good lesson to walk away from in this. The older man nodded. But, I did come to ask you a question, Lieutenant continued. If you're in charge here, did you give the order to torch that town back there? The man tensed, eyes going blank. His lips compressed in a thin line, and Lieutenant knew that whatever he said next was going to be a lie. There's a village back there? Playing dumb. That's pretty much what I figured you would say, Lieutenant sighed. Seems like you don't like to do nothing the easy way. We're just trying to surviving in this world, the graybeard said. Yeah? At what cost? Excuse me? Seems like we should be united in our fight against the Lick, Lieutenant said. Not killing off the few of us left. My people are hungry. Did you ask them to share? Who? The town back there. You called it a village, but I think the population was enough to call it a small town, so that's how I'll refer to it. And you killed every last one of them. I'm responsible for their well-being, Graybeard pointed at the people huddled by the river. Oh yeah? You got them fishing for food? You got them hiding under trees? Out here in the open like this, seems like you would be right picking for the Lick patrols that use this road. They leave us alone, the man answered. Lieutenant snorted. How'd you manage that? An arrangement, said the man. Lieutenant watched his hand drift to the pistol he wore on his belt, nervous fingers scratching the scarred wooden handle of an ancient Colt peacemaker. What kind of arrangement? Lieutenant murmured. We don't have guns like you, Graybeard said. We're reduced to using whatever we can scavenge or build on our own. What kind of arrangement? We just want to be left alone, he said. Fingers wrapping around the butt of the pistol and releasing. Spit flecked on the corner of his lips. Out here in the open, right next to a Lick quarter and you think you're alone. They leave us alone, the man explained. The arrangement? Graybeard nodded. What do you have to give up to get that bargain? No answer. That town? Others like it? He didn't nod. That would be too much of an admission. But his head moved. He breathed out and his fingers gripped the pistol again. Trying to work up to something. How many? Lieutenant growled. How many survivors have you killed? Traded? As many as it takes, the man glared back. He didn't draw though. Lieutenant wanted him to do it. Wanted him to try to fight, try to make a run for it. Even if it wouldn't do him any good. Bonnie stuck the barrel of his rifle under the man's chin and pulled the trigger. The laser blast seared a hole through the top of his head, misting the air with a puff of blood and smoke. Graybeard stood up straight and stiff as the electrical impulses in his brain went into overdrive and shut down in an instant. Lieutenant reached out and gripped the peacemaker, lifting it out as the man fell. I shot first, he said as he turned to his squad. When you retell this story, it's always I shot first. Chapter 14. I don't have a stomach to kill all of these people, Weber said and lowered his rifle. Lieutenant shoved the procured pistol into a pocket on his backpack and sniffed. I don't aim to kill 'em all, said Lieutenant. They ain't Licks. But you killed that man, said Weber. Yeah. Do you think they're going to stand for it? You know what these people are, Weber? Slavers. They kill and capture their own people to give to the Licks to do God knows what with. But it's as good as killing them once they give 'em over. Weber let his eyes travel over the cowering crowd. There are women and children in there, he said in a voice just above a whisper. Lieutenant sighed. I've got a woman and child up there. One's a soldier, one's an orphan, he jabbed a finger at the crowd. Made that way by them. You can't kill them, Weber stated. It makes us no better than them. Lieutenant nodded. I don't want to kill 'em, he said. But I can't leave them out here to block me when we come back with Lutz. I hate this, Weber groaned. You should have just left us in the mountain. Send 'em back to the base, Babe suggested. Lieutenant stared at the corpse with a hole in its head he had left several feet away. Might be like sending the fox into the henhouse, Babe. Babe shrugged. We can't take a kid on a rescue mission, and we can't leave these people here. They might not have real weapons. Get shot with a giant crossbow and tell me how fucking real it feels, said Lieutenant. I meant ones that can hurt us. Lieutenant tapped his chest. Fucking hurts, Babe. Gonna leave a mark and everything. You gonna let me finish or keep busting my balls, Lieutenant? I know where you're going with it, big guy. We spent way too much time together. Hell, I'm practically a mind reader now. Babe smirked. Tell what I'm thinking right now? And fuck you too, buddy. Listen up, he turned to Weber and motioned the others to circle up. The rest of the squad pulled a semicircle around him, blasters ready for the crowd if they needed it. You two, he pointed at Weber and Renard. Get Crockett and take the sponge back to the base. Oakley's gonna go with you, do the babysitting of that rugrat till you get there. He eyed Babe. That what you thinking, Babe? Split our forces so we can do twice as much? Babe nodded. Chief, Waldo, Babe and me are gonna go get Lutz, Lieutenant continued. And find you a fucking bat. You don't look right without one. Chapter 15. Lutz was third in line as the LIC commander led them into the bowels of the facility. The base had once housed a military installation, but the invasion scoured the humans and their defensive measures upon arrival. Lutz had no idea where they were, but he realized the small warehouse that held hundreds of people was just a fraction of the base. He had been kept on the periphery of the grounds. Now, he tried not to gape. The facility was composed of a giant building, built around a massive spaceship. It looked like a cross between the space shuttle pictures he had seen, and a massive cube. Lutz had never been in space, and the last rocket to Mars the humans had sent was years ago. There were no televised launches back then, as if the world leadership wanted the population to forget an invading force was one planet over and a few years away. Launches were done in secret, as was most of the weapons development used to fight the invaders. Those weapons had been sent to the Red Planet, Lutz knew. And when the Licks made it to Earth, they destroyed everything else. Humans were reduced to fighting with rocks. Not literally, he knew, but in a practical sense. The drones were gone. Aircraft gone. Everything more advanced than an RPG, disappeared or stopped working, along with cars, electricity, running water. Hell, humans couldn't even use horses and wagons anymore. LIC patrols zeroed in on anything that moved faster than a run. Now, here he was, staring in wide-eyed wonder at a marvel from beyond the stars. When it didn't blast off into space in a roar of flames and the smell of rocket fuel, he got bored with it. Sure, it was an impressive structure. Large and intimidating, it dominated the landscape, squatting like an alien structure that didn't belong on the planet, thought Lutz. Besides, it looked like a small skyscraper he had seen pictures of, and who could be scared of a building? Even a building filled with 7-foot scale-skinned lizards. He'd killed plenty of Licks to not be scared of them. The man in front of him started moaning. Hey buddy, Lutz whispered to his back. Just be cool. Don't attract their attention. But the man kept moaning. Shit, Lutz groaned. This is not good. It wasn't. The man launched himself at the LIC commander's back. He was able to latch on, wrap his arms around the thick lizard neck and start squeezing. Then his head vaporized, leaving a smoking stump on his neck and a scorch mark on the wall. The body slipped off the LIC commander and plopped to the floor. The alien turned to the remaining 4 men. I hope he wasn't the smartest among you, the voice box hissed. Then the LIC turned his back on them again and kept walking. He wasn't afraid of any of them, thought Lutz. But let me get a weapon and you will be. Chapter 16. They're gone, said Babe. Lieutenant studied the 3 men in front of him. Jake, Babe and Waldo kept their visors open as he locked eyes with each of them. Some folks might argue a bigger force is better, said Lieutenant, but I'm going to say it right now, this is a damn fine group of boys to have at my back. He turned to Waldo. Think you can fly this damn thing? Waldo nodded. If Crockett could do it, it'll be a piece of cake. I ain't had cake in 4 years, said Lieutenant, so maybe you'll make it a little easier than that. Waldo nodded. No worries, Lieutenant, I got this. We'll go in along the road, he said. Stick with that part of the plan at least. I don't know how this place is going to be guarded, I don't know what the layout is like. He watched Jake for a reaction. What about you, Chief? Anything coming back? Jake shook his head. Still don't remember anything about it, he answered. Would help us out if you could. Jake shrugged. I'll try. But he didn't sound like he meant it. Lieutenant motioned the quartet to move forward, spread out in a line, single file. He wasn't sure how far they had to go yet, but the suits made the distance easy. Babe gave voice to his true concern. You think we're enough, Lieutenant? You think the four of us can get it done? Lieutenant nodded. Yeah, Babe. We got a damn good chance, I think. Even with him? Babe nodded to Jake's back, just behind Waldo on point. Lieutenant didn't know how to answer. Jake could be an asset or the distraction they needed. We'll see, Babe. Chapter 17. Lutz paused behind the man in front of him and sucked in a deep breath. Whoa, he exclaimed. The man behind him muttered an echo of surprise as he peered over Lutz's shoulder. You seeing this too? Lutz said, even though he knew the man was. I'm not dreaming, am I? Make this work, Lick Commander hissed from somewhere behind them. They had followed a Lick soldier into the bowels of the base, through a long dark tunnel that seemed to stretch for miles but was probably just several hundred meters. There were no lights for the humans to see. Lutz shifted over to one wall while there was still a dim outline of the entrance where they could see. He put one hand on the wall and let it trail along, praying there wouldn't be a break to throw him off or worse, some denizen of the dark reach out and grab him. He felt rather than heard the other humans move closer to the wall too as the darkness turned complete. Lutz had heard of the phrase, you can't see your hand in front of your face, but had never known what it meant until they were deep into the tunnel. He had always had starlight or the moon, or even firelight coals glowing to see by. This was the absence of all light, the walls complete with no windows, no doors, except the entrance they had passed through and an ending, he hoped. One they would reach soon. Lick Commander hissed them to a halt when they entered a grand cavern and brilliant lights clicked on, flooding the building with lights that popped blue flashbulbs in his skull and made him wince and cover his eyes with his hands until they cleared. When they did, he stood awestruck with the others. I've never seen one in real life, said one of the men. An XSJ Starcraft shuttle perched on the floor. It looked like a Hornet, thought Lutz, except with on yellow or green on the body. Slick lines on a matte black skin, tiny windows where the eyes should be. He knew it was an XSJ thanks to his brother. Before the Licks invaded, his older brother was obsessed with the war on Mars and built models of the military's finest craft to hang from their shared bedroom ceiling. The XSJ was not a fine craft. It looked mean enough, and the military touted its ability to destroy the enemy with stealth and precision. But it had a greater than average odds of blowing up on takeoff, and so the production was halted and the prototypes mothballed. Lutz bit back a quick feeling of missing his brother as he remembered the know-it-all lecture he got on every subject. His brother was an asshole, but he missed him. Chalk another death up to the Licks. Lutz glanced out of the side of his eyes and calculated taking a weapon and opening up. Make it work, Lick Commander hissed again and retreated into the darkness of the tunnel. He was replaced by 6 Lick soldiers who spread across the black opening to pen them in. Lutz looked at the other men. Any of you guys know how to build a rocket ship? It's already built, said one of the men. Then we're halfway there, said Lutz. He didn't know what that meant, but if the Lick wanted to put him in proximity to a potential weapon just so they could figure out how it worked, he felt he owed it to them to learn just that. Then turn it on them. Chapter 18. We're just gonna fly it in, said Waldo. The Lick base was nestled in a valley between 2 small mountains. A series of ridges ran up one mountain, like crumbled broken steps dotted with pine trees and anemic evergreens. The road ran over one of the ridges and through a series of switchbacks, as if the government that built it hadn't wanted to spend the money to blast a straightaway to the door. Each section of the road that dipped behind a ridge gave them an opportunity to hide from view of anyone on the base. It also gave anyone on base time to set up a welcome party if they were identified. Waldo pointed this out. We don't look like a Lick patrol. They're going to be lazy, said Lieutenant. They're going to see one of their own ships, and they won't know anything's gone sideways till we're on top of them. And then it's too late. You could be underestimating them, said Jake. He was staring at the rail line on the far side of the compound that drilled straight into the heart of the buildings and ran along a line to the mountain on the far side. Don't give a Lick credit for thinking for itself, Chief warned. Lieutenant Lick got lucky, that's all. They wiped us out on Mars, Jake snapped. They almost killed the human race here. I don't think you're giving them enough credit. You know how many Lick we've killed, Chief? Lieutenant squinted at the young man. Ain't nobody knows what they're capable of better than me. Lick didn't kill most of the human race, That was damn human stupidity doing it for infighting, jockeying for power and position. Fuckers took their eyes off the prize and were the ones paid the price for it. I think you're overestimating us, Jake said. His eyes never left the railway tracks. I don't overestimate nothing. I don't underestimate neither. What I do is make a plan that ain't gonna survive contact with the enemy. None ever does. So we improvise. We overcome. We adapt, Babe added. Looks quiet. That's what I was thinking, said Waldo. I figured Lutz would have stirred them up. If he's alive, Jake muttered. See those little dots down there, Chief? Those are people. If those people are alive, then Lutz is alive. You don't know that. Lieutenant shrugged. You might be surprised at what I know. The tone of his voice made Jake jerk his head over and look at him. But Lieutenant was glaring at the gates manned by a lit guard. He could spy others scattered around the compound, and a cluster of humans in front of what looked like a warehouse. All right, here's what we're gonna do. Chapter 19. Here's what you need to do, said a human voice from the other side of the starcraft. Lutz didn't jump, even though he was startled by the sound of it. He thought it was just the four of them. A paunchy man with long stringy hair stepped around the side of the derelict space shuttle and blinked at them. He told me he was bringing help. I guess you're the best he's got? The best you're going to get, said Lutz. The man stuck out a grimy palm. Johnson, the man said by way of introduction. Lutz. They shook. Lutz watched as he introduced himself to the others. He told you we were the best? Lutz asked. Yeah, Johnson answered. I've been telling him I need help down here if I'm going to get it started for him. You told him? Yeah, said Johnson. You're working with him? Lutz tried to keep the edge out of his voice. He had heard of collaborators before. Hell, they'd run across a few before and it didn't end well for them. Lieutenant hated collaborators almost as much as he hated licks, and he really fucking hated licks. Just trying to survive, man, said Johnson. You guys have any mechanical training from before? Computers? He ran through several other options, waiting for one of the four to nod. When he got nothing from any of them, Johnson sighed. I don't know what he expects me to do. Make it work, Lutz hissed. Johnson chortled. You don't sound like him, he snorted. But don't let them hear you do it. You could really piss them off. Lutz glanced at the line of guards as they stood unmoving. If I gave a fuck what they thought, we'd be in trouble. Well, I've managed to avoid trouble so far, so let's keep it like that, Johnson said, and this time, there was a harsh edge to his voice. He turned and puttered back to an open panel on the shuttle. The interior was a mass of circuits and wires under a thick shielded hull. There was an oversized 3-ring binder on a rolling workbench, open to show 2 pictures and diagrams. Johnson tinkered with a small green monitor on the cart with wires attached to a motherboard inside the craft. I don't know how he expects me to do this, he muttered as he double-checked the connections. They fried all the tech when they landed. This thing hasn't been working right. Lutz kneeled and looked into the belly of the starcraft. Did the hull shield the components? He wasn't sure if that was even possible, but his brother liked to talk and Lutz thought he remembered him talking about something like that. A new prototype had the capability, but Lutz wasn't sure if it was the XSJ or some other starship. They say yes, I say I don't know. I can't get any readings from the ship, and I can't get it turned on to run an onboard diagnostic. Lutz rocked back on his heels and studied the wiring. It was a jumble to him, and made no sense, but he wanted to buy time and make the lick think they were working on it. How long have you been at this? Months, said Johnson. But he's getting impatient. He? The lick commander. He's planning something. With this? Johnson nodded. What? The man with the paunch shrugged. I don't know how his mind works. But he's a crafty one. Lutz kept his mouth shut and studied the ship. But what he was really looking for was a weapon and an opening. Chapter 20. Lick Commander returned to the room where the nestmate was resting. Is it done? She asked. He licked the air. Not yet. Her yellow eyes narrowed. These humans are worthless, she stated. We could return in my vessel. Lick Commander shook his head. It would be unexpected, but a tactical error, he said, and didn't explain himself further. He knew she would not argue tactics with him, even if she thought she understood the overarching strategy. I grow impatient, she said. In time. She had been here for weeks and she grew impatient, he thought. He had been here for years, since Phase 1, and working with the humans grew tiresome. My talent is wasted, he thought, and turned his back to her to stare at a monitor that showed the grounds around them. Human slaves working on the base. Human prisoners brought to him by other humans to buy their own lives. Such a species, his tongue flickered in disgust. He was destined for grander things. Even though he wasn't of ruling stock, he knew he could rule better than the current occupant of the throne. She slid off of the chaise lounge and joined him at the monitor. The nestmate of his eminence, sent to spy on him, he thought, but perhaps his ally, a champion for his cause. "Do we have time?" she hissed. It was a question he wondered himself. Chapter 21. Time. Lieutenant screamed as the hovercraft vaulted over the closed hurricane fence. Babe leaned over the side of the craft and blew the head off of the lit guard in pop of vapor. Lieutenant, Waldo and Jake stared out at the grounds, rifles ready to meet the response. But there was none. Instead, the craft barreled 9 feet off the ground over the unkempt cracked asphalt that looked like a blackened version of the alien invader's skin. After a few seconds of quiet flying, Waldo pulled his rifle down and took command of the yoke again. "Lieutenant?" "I'm thinking," Lieutenant said. He expected a response. But no one seemed to notice the dead guard, no one paid attention to the hovercraft as it approached the cluster of buildings that made up the center of the compound. Closer now, he could see the humans shuffling with their heads down. That's why they didn't respond to the assault. But the guards with them should have noticed something. Except they didn't. So bored or used to the routine, they didn't even notice the quiet approach of the hovercraft or the single shot of the blaster rifle that took one of their numbers. "Set her down," Lieutenant instructed. Waldo steered for a row of hovercraft and landed with a small bump on the far end of the tarmac in line with the others. "This is where it gets interesting," said Lieutenant and signaled them over the side. They hopped out with the craft between them and the rest of the base, a buffer and screen in case they needed it. There were Lick soldiers milling several hundred meters away, but they didn't glance in the direction of the soldiers in suits. Lieutenant remembered something his grandfather had told him when he was a kid. "Act like you own the place and nobody would bother you or ask you questions." The men usually said it when they were trying to get away with something. Nothing illegal, just stuff like sneaking backstage to meet some country singer the man liked, or trying to get some behind-the-scenes peek at what was going on somewhere. Lieutenant wasn't even sure if it would work with the Lick. Alien psychology wasn't even close to human reasoning, and the doubts a person would experience in the face of authority might not exist with the Lick social structure. But what's the harm in trying, he thought. "Line up, follow me," he ordered in a low voice. "Eyes up and move like you mean it." He marched across the tarmac toward the warehouse where he had seen the prisoners gather. No one bothered them. No one called out a challenge, or sent a bolt blasting into them. No one even seemed to notice them. Lieutenant glanced back at the squad to make sure they were keeping up and stopped. Babe whipped his rifle around, ready to fight, but the aliens still ignored them. "Your suit," Lieutenant indicated and stared down at his own arm. The suits were changing, shifting in patterns of chameleon colors that matched the background and surrounds of the buildings they were against. "It's camo," said Babe as he stared in wonder. "Doc didn't tell us about this," said Waldo. "Wonder if he knew?" Lieutenant ran his eyes over the display in his helmet, wondering if the scroll of information could help him. He found it in the lower right corner with the words "innate screen." "It's the damn nano," he said. Waldo looked from Babe to Jake and back to Lieutenant. "The Licks can't see us." "Nah," said Lieutenant, "I think we're just harder to see. We stand here long enough holding our peckers, one of 'em's bound to come along and shoot it off for us." He started toward the warehouse again and didn't wait to see if the others fell in line. "Scorch marks," Babe pointed out. "That entrance is new." Lieutenant saw it too. The front of the building had been hastily repaired, the burn and shoot marks of a fire still evident on the exterior of the structure. Broken windows flickered in the sunlight on one side. 2 Lick soldiers stood guard on the doorway, watching the last of the slaves trudge in from their various workstations. The air around them flickered and part of the wall detached. They had just enough time to slip out their tongues in surprise before 2 pops turned their faces into scalding mist. Waldo grabbed one body and dragged it into the room. Babe grabbed the other. Jake and Lieutenant moved in behind them. "Watch our 6, Lieutenant instructed the boy. There were 2 more guards at the far end of the building. Lieutenant used a hand signal to send Babe and Waldo to dispatch them while he studied the inside of the warehouse. He was glad he couldn't smell through the helmet. He saw pockets of prisoners huddled in small masses on tattered and lice-infested blankets. They were crammed in tight, at least 100 of them in a space where 50 would be crowded. Babe and Waldo dragged the guards on the far side into the building and jogged back to him. "Why aren't they reacting?" Babe asked. Lieutenant wondered the same thing. The sudden appearance of soldiers in suits should have started a surge of chatter or at least a reaction of some sort. Instead, the prisoners stared at them with weary exhaustion and creepy silence. "Let's get Lutz and get the hell out of here," said Waldo. He popped up his visor with a snick. "Lutz," he took a deep breath and gagged. Babe slid his visor and snickered. "Lightweight," he chided. "Lutz." Jake ran up with the prisoner in tow. "Lieutenant," he said. "This one asked for the one in charge." Lieutenant looked at her, but kept his visor down. "He said Lutz." She pointed at Babe. "You know him?" Babe shouted as he tried to hold his breath. Waldo slid his faceplate back in place and cursed the stench of unwashed bodies and death that seemed to cling to him and his suit. The girl nodded. "They took him on a special work detail," she said. Lieutenant noted her thin arms, thin legs and greasy hair. She would have been pretty under different circumstances, but as a prisoner, she looked haunted and beaten. Sores crusted the corners of her mouth. "You know where?" Lieutenant asked. She nodded. "Show us," Babe ordered. She nodded again and led them toward the back door past the two deadlit guards. Lieutenant saw she didn't flinch. In fact, she was a pretty cool customer for 4 suits showing up in the middle of her giant prison cell. "Something squirrely," he said to Babe. Babe kept his rifle ready as he followed her. "Yeah, but she knows Lutz," he answered. The girl led them through the back door and across the compound. Another warehouse stood with the door ajar. "He went in there," she stopped and pointed. Lieutenant held Jake back. "Check it out," he told Babe and Waldo. They 2 soldiers went into the building and came back seconds later. "It's empty," said Waldo. "But there's a door on the other side, goes into a tunnel." Lieutenant turned on the girl. "You know where that tunnel goes?" She shook her head. "Is that the work detail?" Again she shrugged. "Damn it," said Lieutenant. No plant survived contact, he thought. "Take her back and tie her up," he told Jake. "She's a prisoner, Lieutenant," Jake protested. "Just till we come back through with Lutz." Jake shook his head. "Yes sir," he agreed. "You cover us till we get back, keep this way open. We can grab a hovercraft from here." He watched Jake lead the girl back to the hovercraft, then led Waldo and Babe into the second warehouse. Chapter 22. There, the nestmate tapped her claw against the monitor to draw the commander's eyes to it. He stared at the apparition from the past. 3 suits marched through one of the facilities and into the dark tunnel toward his human spaceship. "They do not look like the other humans," she hissed. "They are not like the other humans," he answered. "They wear the battle armor we encountered when first on the red planetoid." "Warriors?" she breathed, tongue twirling to taste danger or fear. He had none for her. "I have encountered these before in space," he told her. "I know their weakness." "Send in the fodder and destroy them," she advised. But he shook his snout. "That is not their weakness," he informed her. She watched him turn and stalk across his command chamber to a small alcove recessed into the composite wall. He keyed a sequence into the coded lock. A section of the wall whisked upwards to reveal a small compartment, large enough for him to stand in and move around. The LIC commander entered the tiny room and shut the door behind him before the nestmate could see what was inside or ask any questions. Chapter 23. Lieutenant moved against one wall out of habit. He didn't need it for cover. The tunnel was pitch black on the exterior of the suit. Inside his helmet though, he could see as if it was daylight. The heads-up display gave him a graphical representation of the area they moved through. Babe and Waldo trailed after him, spaced out so they could react if something happened. He expected it to happen soon. His gut was twinging like a drum, and he bet the nano inside of him was working overtime to counteract the adrenaline dump his brain was doing. He could feel it, the edge of anticipation and almost excitement before engaging battle. He fucking hated fighting, but a small part of him loved it too. And he didn't like that about himself, but he accepted it. Lieutenant supposed that was why he was pretty good at it. Fighting, that is. Killing the LIC. There was no inner conflict to make a bullet stray, or the blasts from this first-generation rifle he held now. He was okay with killing the aliens, okay with killing the humans that collaborated with them, and the suit made it easier to get the job done. It also made him feel more robotic, though he wondered if that was because he kept catching glimpses of his squad out of the corner of his eye before, or even himself in a reflection on their faceplate. He looked like a robot, so he felt like a robot inside. "Damn nanos," he muttered. Maybe the miniature robots inside his system were making him feel that way. Or maybe he just missed the keyed-up feeling from the adrenaline. He figured that was it, because he could still feel like killing licks, he said under his breath. Babe made a questioning noise behind him. "Heads up," said Lieutenant. The end of the tunnel appeared in growing shades of brightness and they slowed to a crawl. Lieutenant led Babe and Waldo to a harsh edge of light that demarcated the end of the tunnel. Bonnie held up 2 fingers on his right hand to indicate the guards on his right. He pointed to Babe, and pointed the fingers at the back of their lizard heads. Babe nodded. He repeated the action to indicate the 2 on the left to Waldo, and the soldier acknowledged with a half salute, then raised his rifle to his shoulder. Lieutenant shouldered his own weapon and took aim at the back of one of the guards. He fired, and the tunnel filled with 6 flashes of light that vaporized the lit guards. Their bodies hadn't even hit the floor when the 3 armored suits sprinted into the room, breaking formation. Babe flanked right. Waldo flanked left and Lieutenant ran up the center. Another guard whirled around and got off one shot that went over Lieutenant's head before he was drilled in the snout by a bright beam. Babe took out another. Johnson screamed and turned to run, the other humans joining him, but there was nowhere to go. Lutz grabbed a pipe and turned to face this new threat. He drew back over his shoulder and prepared to go down fighting. "For Babe!" he screamed and charged Lieutenant. Bonnie dodged to one side and Lutz missed. Lieutenant slid his visor up. "What the hell, Lutz, you gonna go after a superior officer like that?" Lutz dropped the pipe and tried not to cry. "Lieutenant!" he screamed and wrapped his arms around the suit. Lieutenant pounded him on the back as Babe and Waldo ran across the room. Lutz saw Babe in the suit and let go of Lieutenant to grab his best friend. "Goddamn, took you long enough," he sniffed. Babe couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Waldo curled his arms around both of them, blaster still held in one hand. "Alright boys, we can do the reunion once we're out of here," Lieutenant rasped past a lump of his own. "What the hell you got here, Lutz?" He eyed the StarCraft squatting in the middle of the room. "XSJ, Lieutenant," Lutz swiped the tears leaking from his eyes. "That damn lick wanted us to get it started for him." Lieutenant stared at the dark tunnel in the shuttle, debating. He rushed over to the matte black shuttle and circled it. "Could you?" "This guy was working with them on it," Lutz pointed out Johnson. "Collaborator," Babe spit. "Bring him here," Lieutenant said. Waldo jerked the cowering man out of the huddle of prisoners standing aimless as they watched the soldiers in strange suits rescue one of them. "You get this thing to fly?" Johnson shook his head, stringy hair flapping around his thin face. "What's wrong with it?" "If I knew that, I could make it work." "You a rocket scientist?" Johnson shook his head again. "Just unlucky enough to figure things out," he said. Lieutenant eyed the paunch of his stomach, out of place among the emaciated prisoners. "Looks like you figured out something," he sneered. "I am a survivor," Johnson shrugged. "You haven't made it out of here yet," Lieutenant told him and bit back on the pleasure he got watching the man shiver in fear. "All right," Lieutenant turned to Waldo and Babe. "No time to stay here and get it running." "Destroy it?" Waldo asked. He lifted his blaster and sent a shot into the XSJ as Johnson screamed no and dropped to the floor. The beam bounced off the hull and ricocheted into one of the prisoners, splattering him across the floor. "Damn it, Waldo," shouted Lieutenant. "I was aiming for the engine," Waldo pouted. "Was he one of the good ones?" Lieutenant asked Lutz. Lutz shrugged. "Didn't know him. Don't know any of them." "The hull is blast-proof," said Johnson as he climbed off the floor. "You can't destroy it with our weapons." "These things weren't that stable to begin with," said Lutz. "My brother told me they all blew up going into space." "Not all of them," said Babe. "Most of them." "Well, if he can't get this one running, we're not going to leave someone behind who can. You're coming with us." Johnson started to back away. He turned and ran. Lutz lunged after him. "Wait," Lieutenant ordered. "Babe, Waldo, get all them out of here. I'll grab that one." He started after the fleeing man who ran to the far end of the room, trying to keep the shuttle between himself and the man in the suit. Babe and Waldo rounded up the survivors, including Lutz, and led them into the dark tunnel. "Look here, idiot," Lieutenant said as he stalked after the man. "You got 2 choices in this matter. Either I shoot you, or you come with." A hidden doorway opened on the other side of Johnson. "There's a third option," said Jake as he stepped through. He cracked Johnson across the back of the head with the butt of his rifle and kicked the body out of the way, leaving a smear of crimson on the polished concrete floor. "What the fuck are you doing here?" Lieutenant stared at the doorway. "Following orders," said Jake. LIC Commander ducked under the hidden panel and moved into the room. He wore an exoskeleton much like the one Lieutenant wore, designed for his 7-foot frame. Lieutenant didn't bother to nest his rifle. He sent a blast toward the alien and a second toward Jake. The boy was fast and ducked out of the way. The alien not so much. The blast slammed into its chest and sent it sprawling on the floor. Jake ran for the dark tunnel entrance, shooting over his shoulder as he ran. None of the blasts came close, but it forced Lieutenant to duck. Jake hit the dark edge of the tunnel and disappeared after Waldo and Babe. Bonnie jumped up to run after him, and had just enough time to see a blur out of the corner of his eye. LIC Commander slammed into him and pounded him into the wall. Lieutenant slid to the floor. The alien grabbed him by the boot and twirled him across the room. The blaster flew one way, Lieutenant the other. He crashed into the side of the shuttle and slid down. Lieutenant blinked back the shadows, trying to gain his feet to keep the world from going black. An alarm blared inside his helmet, warnings flashing red as the computerized components tried to reroute systems. He glanced around, searching for a weapon as the alien stalked toward him. Chapter 24. Jake ran through the darkness. The heads-up display inside his helmet turned the interior of the tunnel into a tinge of green, but he didn't notice. He only saw the way was clear. His mind was racing as he tried to recall why he was running. Someone had been there. Someone stepped out of the shadows as he guarded the entrance and spoke to him in a hissing robotic voice. He couldn't remember anything else, except to run. They were back there. A platoon of licks or more. They killed Lieutenant and Jake almost didn't make it. He couldn't remember. He only knew he was running, trying to escape. Death chased him in the darkness. He almost shot Babe. The giant was standing in the middle of the tunnel, rifle aimed at Jake as he ran. The young man slid to a stop and almost spilled onto his knees despite the compensators in the suit. "What the hell are you doing here?" Babe screamed. "They got Lieutenant," Jake sobbed. "He sent me to flank and they got him." Babe started to run back up the tunnel, but Jake grabbed him. "There are too many of them," he screamed. He aimed his rifle at the concrete roof of the tunnel and fired a bolt into ceiling. Dust and chunks of debris rained down like a scattering of stone rain. "We have to get him," Babe yelled. "No time," Jake shouted back. "They're coming." He could see them. In his mind, he saw the platoon, moving through the darkness as they threatened to overwhelm them. The alien snouts licking the air, tasting victory. He set a second, then a third blast into the ceiling. Waldo ran to them. "Where's Lieutenant?" he screamed in the noise and confusion. "Dead," Babe said in a flat voice. "Fucking licks killed him." "They're coming," Jake screamed over the whine of his blaster. Babe and Waldo joined him, sending shots of their own into the ceiling. It cracked and crumbled in a cascading avalanche that blocked the way into the warehouse. A plume of dust and smoke chased the trio out of the tunnel and enveloped the entrance. It covered the suits in a layer of grime. Lutz coughed and gagged in the cloud. Babe lifted him up and carried him out. "Lieutenant?" he coughed. But no one could answer him. Chapter 25. "You started all of my trouble," LIC Commander hissed through the voice box attached to his suit. The plodding footsteps echoed on the chamber floor as he stalked toward Lieutenant. Bonnie kept blinking. The suit protected him from most of the blows, and the flight through the air almost would have been fun, except for the landing. The landing hurt. The lick got closer and sent a boot into his helmet. Again, the suit absorbed most of the blow, but something about the physics of the angle cracked his jaw to one side as his head spun around. He crawled across the floor, made it 6 feet before an alien boot cracked into his ribs and sent him into the machine attached to the XSJ. He fumbled off the floor, hands pounding the unseen keys as his gloved fingers fought for purchase. Lieutenant spied his blaster and leapt for it. He wrapped his fingers around the tip of the barrel as the alien grabbed his boot and sent him spinning through the room again. This time he held onto it as he tumbled, flipped through the air and smashed on his back to fetch up against the corner where the wall met the floor. Lieutenant rolled over, lifted the rifle and aimed at the LIC Commander. He squeezed the trigger. The blaster made a pitiful whine that grew in volume. Lieutenant saw the barrel was crimped just as his headset went all red with a critical overload warning. He didn't think. He whipped the blaster at the alien's head, because if it was going to blow, it might as well take an enemy with him. The LIC Commander ducked, his reflexes enhanced by the modified suit he wore as well. The rifle sailed over its head, clattered on the concrete floor and fetched up against the hidden doorway. Lieutenant had enough time to duck, cover his head as the wine reached an ear-splitting pitch and the world around them went supernova in an explosion that turned everything white before it went dark. The adventure continues in Ultima Thule.